What's up, climber? Get excited. We've got cardio conditioning, we got strength training, all combined. Sit low, reach high. Come on. Keep working, keep working.
Lots of stuff won't work. Don't only do what you know and like best. And third, hire people smarter than you. While that may sound like advice, like what kind of moron would do any one of those three? But when you think about these and you give thought to these three principles, the beauty of that, there are 27 more that are just as valuable. And these are written by a friend named Scott Miller, who has written two wonderful books in the universe that I have enjoyed immensely. One of them is called Management Mess to Leadership Success. And Scott was on our program several months ago to discuss that. But even better than that, he sent me the book called Marketing Mess to Brand Success. And I said, oh, it looks like we've got a series here. And when I read the book, I didn't just like this book, I loved this book. So I'm gonna hold it up, Marketing Mess. If you can see this, I've got a virtual background, but it's called Marketing Mess to Brand Success, written by Scott Miller. I'm gonna tell you who Scott is in the event you don't know, but give me just a second. Today's show is sponsored by Climber. I'm Chuck Garcia. I'm the host of A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation. And our show today is sponsored by Climber, CLMBR, the most efficient full body cardio and strength fitness machine, available with instructor-led on-demand and fitness classes. Key investors in Climber include Novak Djokovic, Jay-Z, and Ryan Seacrest. To learn more about Climber, go to clmbr.com. Use code CHUCK250 at checkout to save $250 on your full paid offer. Climber also offers a variety of very convenient interest-free financing option. So click www.climberclmbr.com and input your code CHUCK20. Offers cannot be combined and only valid on full pricing. So Scott Jeffrey Miller, welcome back to A Climb to the Top.
Chuck, thank you, man. I'm honored to be back on your platform. What a great pleasure it is to see you again. Thanks for turning your spotlight onto me for Marketing Mess to Brand Success.
Well, you bet, Scott, but you made it really easy, because I remember when I read your first book, Management Mess, and it's like, this is a really good book, and it was vulnerable and it was powerful. And what you really talked about is experience is the name you give to your mistakes. Yeah. So a little bit of time came between then and the publication of your next book. But before we get into that, to our listeners who may not know you, you have been with this wonderful organization called Franklin Covey, who is behind the great book, the Bible out there, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But Scott, tell us what you are doing now in the transition from Franklin Covey, still Franklin Covey, but also what you're doing for Scott Miller as well.
Well, thank you for asking. So 25 years with the Franklin Covey Company. Before that, 4 years with the Walt Disney Company. Right. I served for about 8 years as the Chief Marketing Officer for Franklin Covey and the Executive Vice President of Thought Leadership. In that, I host the world's largest leadership podcast, and I lead their books in media strategy. So I separated from the firm on very good standing. And the CEO asked me if I would stick around for 3 years as an independent advisor and continue to help to host their podcast and drive their thought leadership strategy. And that allowed for me to pursue some of my own passions, no longer as an executive officer in a public company. There's some weight off my shoulders there. Yeah. And so now I'm blogging, I'm writing, I'm speaking, podcasting, and have many more books planned, not just in the Mess to Success series, but also in another series I'm offering called Master Mentors with HarperCollins. So I'm having a blast. I'm 53. I have boys that are 6, 9, and 10 with my wife. And so I'm able to spend a little more time making them a priority in my life right now. So I'm very blessed and grateful for this transition outside of Franklin Covey, but still, part of the family.
Well, as I read the book, it was a personal account. It was certainly written in your voice, and you spoke of your family and the love of your wife and your children. But there's an interesting word that you include right in the book that I think, as a father of 4 myself, what we know is we go from an organization where there is enormous pressure and expectations, and it's often a mess. And then we go home and you see toys all over the floor and it's a mess, and someone's hungry and someone's screaming. And yet the love that you have for both sides of your life came through on both of these books, but especially this. But here's the big question. You decided to call this series, and your first management and your second marketing and what's to come is job, the big word, mess.
Right.
Why did you choose that word?
Yeah, very deliberately. like you, I'm a podcast host. I've just finished my 150th episode for Franklin Covey. And, my experience after having been in this business for 30 years, the leadership business, is there's very few leadership books written by CEOs or entrepreneurs or any successful business person teaching leadership that shows the underbelly of leadership. That is tough. It's not for everyone. Not everyone should be a marketer. Not everyone should be a CEO. And we all have a mess in our lives. This is a fact. And I think philosophically, after having hired hundreds of people and having to terminate dozens of people, that we tend to learn more from our messes than we do from our successes. We tend to learn more from our leaders' messes than we do from them just bragging about all their successes. I actually think it's the finest leaders that exercise the vulnerability and the humility to teach through their own messes. And so I wanted to build a series that talked about from mess to success. Just own your mess, because when you own your mess, you make it safe for others to own theirs, not to wallow in them, not to make excuses, but to talk about it freely and openly. And I just have found after, almost 40 years in business now, not quite 40, 35 years, that people want to work for leaders who are relatable. People want to have a culture and environment where they're not fear-based, where they can talk about their mistakes, where actually it's okay to make a mistake. And that culture helps you kind of move through it to success. So the whole series, to your point, is from mess to success.
Well, what you exhibited and what I read about is, as you know, Scott, I'm an executive coach to many companies, and I worked on two succession plans where I was helping to develop who was going to be the next CEO. And interestingly enough, those projects were in my head when I was reading your book, because what the board of directors had said very clearly in both of these projects, the three top characteristics we want for their next CEO. It had nothing to do with where they went to school. Their pedigree, it's not that it wasn't important, but they said, here are the three characteristics. Number one, someone who exhibits grace under fire, can stay calm under enormous pressure. Number two, one who resolves conflicts effectively. And number three, showing an empathetic leadership style. They said the days of the 800-pound gorilla bossing people around in a command environment are gone. So you must have mustered a lot of courage to be able to bring these stories where other people would have said, man, this guy, what's wrong with him? How did you come to peace with that was going to be your approach? Was it hard?
Yeah, it was probably a risk. I mean, I'll probably never work in an organization again. Right? I'll have to be a successful entrepreneur, which I hope happens. I came to realize that the best leaders that I worked for were not the ones that were buttoned down and appeared perfect and everything was gleaming. It was those that had some setbacks in life, personally and professionally, and were quite public about talking about them, not gratuitously, right? Not having a confession personality, but I just found great power in this concept of vulnerability. I think vulnerability is a leadership competency. So I decided at age 50, I was going to kind of own my story, own my journey, the things that I'd done well, things I'd done poorly, the things that were public and not public, and give permission for other people to be more accepting of their story, their journey, and be okay with your messes, because all of our lives are a mess and everybody knows it. As much as you may try to fake it, everybody knows your credit score, everybody knows your sexuality, everybody knows your net worth. Generally speaking, people know. So stop hiding it and just own it, love it, and work through it and teach through it. So for me, it was a bit of a bold stretch, but at the age of 50, I decided I was just going to be more transparent. And if I could help other people own their mess by talking freely about mine, then that was a huge legacy I could leave to not just my colleagues, but to readers and to people of my followers online and such. And I think it's actually been a good decision.
Well, I appreciate that, because as I sometimes stare down the face of my Columbia students, they come in needing to be perfect. And the first rule I give them is don't ever be afraid to make a mistake. Be afraid of not learning from those mistakes. That's one of the big themes I got out of your book, is really the encouragement to, and in fact, one of your principles, try, fail, I forget exactly the words, but it was, don't be afraid to screw. Lots of stuff won't work.
Lots of stuff won't work.
Yeah. That was a good chapter. And just try. But you talked about the innovations and like in Good to Great, turning the flywheel just a little bit at a time. And turning the flywheel and making sure that whatever that is, you're going to get through it. But here's something big. And there's a chapter you wrote that I think was, to me, the most important part of the book, and it may surprise you. Utah has a big basketball tradition between a guy named John Stockton and Karl Malone. What he talked about was the assist, Stockton to Malone. I want to use that metaphor because I think so much of what you talk about is the need for internal buy-in, that you have two customers. You have the people you're trying to reach that are going to drive revenue. But more important than that is the foundation by which you're going to do your job well is based upon the ability to collaborate with others, that all of us are better than anyone. That's what you talked about. And I want the listeners to key in on this because it was a really cool metaphor. Stockton to Malone, chief sales officer, chief marketing officer, different and complementary skills. Can you explain that chapter and why the metaphor of the assist is so important?
Yeah, I'm not a big basketball follower, but like you said, the duo here was John Stockton to Karl Malone, and I may have this not exactly right, but one of John Stockton's key legacies, what his job was in essence to get the ball up to the net, so that the much perhaps even more talented in some ways or taller Karl Malone could dunk it in. Now I've simplified that story, but I love it because nobody thought John Stockton was a less valuable player. In fact, he might even been paid as much or more than Karl Malone. I don't know. His legacy is certainly intact in the histories of basketball. But I saw marketing and sales very similar. I think two of the biggest cancers in every organization, first is gossip, is duplicity. It's the biggest cancer in every company is gossip. The second biggest cancer, I think, is the ongoing tension, blame between sales and marketing. And that I wanted to set a new legacy to where I would eliminate that. That even though I was a sales vice president, I was responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue on the sales side before I came to the marketing side. And in the chapter, I talk about how the executive vice president of sales and the executive vice president of marketing were peers. We made the same amount of money. We reported to the CEO, but I decided to subjugate. I decided to take a step and make sure that I was serving him and his needs. Again, we both had strong personalities. We are good friends to this day, but I just wanted to break the cycle of marketing cooking stuff up and then blaming sales when it didn't work, or sales blaming marketing for missing their goals. And I wanted to position marketing in a way to recognize that I think too many marketers talk too much about impressions, and likes and follows, and brand equity. And those are important things. I want distinguished brand equity. I work for one of the biggest brands in the world. But you can't staple brand equity to the back of a bank deposit slip and fund payroll. I mean, maybe ethereally you can. By the end of the day, there's got to be cash in the bank. You got to have paying customers. So
and I devoted a chapter to that. Well, mine
that's
just,
right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just very passionate around making sure that marketing understands your role is to drive revenue and set sales up for success. You are John Stockton, and sales is Karl Malone, and both are vital and valuable and well paid, and they can't work out the other. And that's my philosophical bent. And I'll bet you, in some cases, sales leaders might like this book more than marketers do. Because in some cases, I take marketers to task to transform the conversation around what is the relationship, what is the high trust relationship between sales and marketing, and how do their teams align and build around that? So that's the metaphor of Stockton to Malone.
No, I really liked it. But as I continue to read through the book, what hit me was something that I can't say I was surprised, but knowing your style, you spoke very much of your intuition, your instincts, your big personality. You cast a big net, you put a lot of fish, you got a way to do it. And not everybody does it your way. But it was interesting how throughout the book, right somewhere in the middle, you talked about the importance of instilling processes. And while when small companies go to medium and big, what everybody complains about, we become bureaucratic, what happened to us? Yet you didn't. That wasn't your point. But I want you to explain that, but also your orientation toward your style and how processes don't get in the way. You're just finding excuses to inhibit what is the advancement. Talk about why that. I wasn't expecting that, and I loved it. Talk about why you wrote that chapter.
Well, and this may not be everybody's experience, but my experiences has been generally that, creative types, right-brainers, tend to gravitate towards, marketing and advertising agencies and careers and divisions. And that obviously is a blanket statement. It's not entirely accurate, but I think there's directional accuracy in that. And that I think a lot of creative types don't enjoy processes. They're constrictive, they're forcing, they're limiting. And big thinkers and visionary marketers like to express their ideas, and we can go off on a rat hole, right? Chasing. I think Donald Miller calls it like a mouse chasing a rat in a wind chime factory or something like that. I've got it wrong, right? But that can be marketing. So I was just being very vulnerable, talking about how the more disciplined marketers that worked for me were trying to install some systems, communication systems, digital asset management systems. And I was used to operating in a fairly, everybody come in, let's talk about this, right? And as the division moved from 4 people to almost 40 people, we had to have processes. Stuff was being dropped to the ground. I could no longer hold instant meetings with, everybody dropping what they're doing. And for too long, I think people managed their style accommodating my style. And the company's needs got bigger than just, managing towards Scott's style. So I share some, very vulnerable stories around how I torpedoed some of the systems that I found limiting, and how, as a creative mind, you have to come to a point to where you appreciate that systems are there to not just help you, but they also might be there to protect your team from you. Every team sometimes needs to be protected from their leader. If it's their energy, their distraction, their nonstop ideas. It might be, Liz Wiseman wrote a book called Multipliers. I love this book. I think it's the best leadership book ever written.
Yeah.
And she mentions in Oracle, on her door, she had a sign that said, "Ignore me as needed to get your job done." And I think in some cases, I think in some cases, marketers need to do the same thing. You got to protect your team from you, and you have to be able to recognize when is your creativity out of control and needs to be focused with good processes.
Yeah, and I appreciated that, because I think all of us struggle with that, particularly the entrepreneur. You and I both represented very large brands. Yeah. We appreciated that the process is the one thing we can all agree on. Your style in particular, not unlike mine, very energetic, lots of ideas, but often that leaves a lot of confusion because, my boss said 10 things. What am I supposed to do? I'll pick the 3 best. No, they're going to pick all 10, and they're going to do a mediocre job on 10. So this gets to the next chapter that I really enjoyed. And I think this is the college professor in me. I don't teach to volume, I teach to impact. But when you talked about this, is more is not better. Yeah. Better is better. And I think in this world, people think that the more that they give, that's going to be better. Talk about the importance of this chapter. And I want to repeat that to our listeners. More is not better. Pause for dramatic effect. Better is better. Great lesson here.
This is a struggle for me, Chuck. I don't model this well. I love volume. I love bigger and better, right? I love, I love shock and awe. And it's one of my messes, quite frankly, is my sort of unbridled creativity, which is my biggest asset, is not surprisingly my biggest liability. It comes from this concept: there will always be more great ideas than there is capacity to execute, right? To mention the book you quoted, Good to Great, and Jim Collins, it's your flywheel, your hedgehog. He calls them BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. Right. I read a book a couple of years ago from Brendon Burchard called High Performance Habits. Phenomenal book. Brendan's a friend of mine. Yeah. And Brendan, wrote about this idea called PQO. He calls it PQO, prolific quality output. And he, like me, shares a very vulnerable story around his goal was to become a speaker and an online trainer. But he knew he had to write some books to build that profile. So he had to resist his temptation to be into 10, 15 things and become uncharacteristically devoted to a disciplined working schedule to get great books written. So I share the chapter, more is not better, better is better, is because a lot of us are tempted to value quantity over quality. It's a natural temptation in all areas of our life, whether it be parenting, whether it be our love relationships, whether it be our brand, whether it be clients, you name it. It's a great lesson. There will always be more there'll always be more great ideas than there is capacity to execute. So you may have to put some mentors, some coaches, some guidelines, some processes in, some high courage people to say, Scott, you had 10 genius ideas this week. To your point, Chuck, you can't execute all of them. What's the one thing or maybe the two things we should be crushing, as opposed to, water skiing across 8 or 9 things. Let's scuba dive and score on 1 or 2. I struggle with this, but it's exceptional advice for people that are thinking about how to position their brand, their own personal brand, well, as someone who delivers what Brendan Bouchard says, prolific quality output, PQO.
Well, that leads to another really important chapter, and I want to get to this. What you described, and certainly in my own experience when we started a sales campaign, what do? We find a bazillion targets out there. We want to fish in the ocean. We don't want to fish in a small lake. So we think about who are our customers, and we have to think big, because if we're not thinking big, if our spreadsheet isn't big, if our targets aren't gigantic, we're not thinking big enough. You come along and you flip the model, and you talked about in challenge number 11, define your smallest viable market.
Yeah.
And as I read that, I said, you are one of the few who says, come down and find your avatar. Forget all those whales and elephants you're trying to hunt. This was, I think, of all the challenges of the 30, this was the one that I think was the most valuable, because it's counterintuitive. So to many people who are told, go out and hunt the elephants, talk about the development of that chapter. Really good one.
Yeah, well, of course, we know the idea is not mine, it's Seth Godin's, right?
Yeah,
Seth Godin,
you give him a lot
about it. But I'm a big raving fan of Seth Godin. He's very good to me personally.
Right.
And so I credit Seth. Buy his book, This Is Marketing. I think it's one of the best, if not the best, marketing book ever written. And he popularizes this idea of this, again, counterintuitive marketing talent, which is don't go out and boil the ocean. Right. No, everybody is not your customer. No, everybody is not your reader. Don't go after the largest viable market, which is everyone's temptation to, quantify the business opportunity. Maybe that's great for your investors and your business plan, but at the end of the day, I think Seth proves this principle right, which is, no, what is your smallest viable market? Who is your first buyer? What is their name? Who is your first podcast listener? What is her name?
Right.
And it's really a difference between, I call it net fishing and spear fishing. Right. There's a place for both, perhaps.
Good metaphor.
But I think the most successful marketers, leaders, are those that are insanely clear. Who is their buyer? What is their circumstance, right? To quote Clayton Christensen, what is their job to be done? What problem are they hiring you to solve? Whether it be you own a restaurant, or you own a clothing store, or you have an Etsy account, or whatever it is, what problem has someone identified in their life? And what do they call it? What words do they use to call it? Do they have budget for it? And how can you make sure that they know about you? Everyone's temptation is to say, oh yeah, well, my book really is for everyone. No, it's not. My book's not for everyone. It is a temptation that all of us get sucked into. Bigger, think global, think China, think Asia. No, think what street and what city are your customers in, and how do you go nail them and make them raving fans and have them evangelize for you and become your brand ambassadors. And although it's tough to do, it will pay you dividends down the road long term, like focusing on your largest viable market never could.
Well, this brought me back even to my sales training early in my career, my Bloomberg days, a concept called land and expand. Don't try to conquer the universe. Find a very small part and start building out. I want to switch the focus here, because there isn't, you pay homage to two of your big heroes out there. Certainly Seth Godin, and I appreciate that. He is awesome. But also the late, great Clayton Christensen. And I've loved How Will You Measure Your Life? I use it in my classes. My students find it enormously impactful. Tell me what you learned about yourself as you were writing this books, and how you measure your life, whether it's based on Clayton Christensen's principles or your own.
In fact, I think I even share a research study in the book about the ability to change your mind, right? And move from a deliberate to an emergent strategy. When you turn 50, something happens. I'm 52. And, you get a little less concerned about how big your house is and how expensive your car is. And you become more focused on your relationships. A pandemic will do that to you, by the way. You become more focused on your legacy. Not how will I be remembered, but whose life will I change? What are the names of the people whose 401ks will be bigger, or whose financial security will be better, or their self-confidence will improve? And so I think for me, what I've learned most from Clayton and from writing the book and from turning 50 and post-pandemic is I want a nice car, right? And I want to take nice vacations, but I want to leave a legacy of sharing the messes that I've struggled with, the successes that I've also had, but try to leave as big an impact as possible on helping other people learn from my mistakes and help to build their, like I said, self-confidence, their self-esteem, their self-worth, their ability to build some wealth for their families as well. So I'm fiercely focused the next decades on my legacy, not how I'll be remembered, but the impact positively that I can have on as many people's lives to give them some of the wisdom that I've gleaned from other people. The book really is, like you say, a homage to,
a lot of people.
Not a lot of people, right? I'm just an aggregator. I'm not sure I've ever had an original idea in my thought. I'm a pretty good aggregator. I'm pretty darn good at giving credit to others.
Yep.
And so I hope to spread that as much as possible.
And I appreciate that. And let's finish up with here, our minimal or our viable market here, our avatar.
Yeah.
28, 29, 6, 7 years into the career, male, female, they are emerging. They are looking for advice from guys like you, guys like us, all of us trying to help them, because those of us that pass 50 recognize that we're put on the planet to make the world. You, Scott, and I both go to work in the service of someone else's success. I can't always say I did that. I suspect you would probably say the same, until all of a sudden we have something that inspires us to want to bring that to others. So let's leave it with for the 28-year-old who is listening to the show, is a working professional. What do you want them to do with your book after they finish reading it?
This may be an indirect, great question, by the way. This may be an indirect outcome. Two things. Your reputation, your brand, of which you have one, either created deliberately or created accidentally or haphazardly. Your brand is merely the collection of all the decisions you make. All the lies you tell, all the truths you tell, all the apologies you offer, all the ownership you take. Your reputation is merely a collection of all your decisions in life. Remember that. Secondly, all that matters in life are relationships. It's all that matters. Amen. Relationships with your customers, with your competition, with your investors, with your family, with your ex-friends, with your colleagues. All that matters in life are relationships, and you should be fiercely focused on building as strong, mutually beneficial, trustworthy relationships as possible. One of my favorite quotes came from a gentleman whose name I didn't catch when I was giving a keynote a few years ago. When I asked him what his takeaway was from my hour-and-a-half keynote, he raised his hand and he said, "I'm going to begin behaving myself into a reputation of being trusted by others. I'm going to behave myself into a reputation of being trusted by others." And I hope that that's an outcome of people reading this book, whether it be your vendors, your clients, your future customers, your internal stakeholders, whoever. Behave yourself into being trusted by others.
Yeah, and you're describing what we call the as if principle. Behave as if you are whatever that means. No, that's wonderful advice. Well, to our listeners, I'm Chuck Garcia. My guest today is Scott Jeffrey Miller, who wrote a series of beautiful books. Actually, one last question. I see behind you, I have had the joy of reading Management Mess, Marketing Mess, but there's another thing with a different color called Job Mess. What can we expect in the future?
Well, there are 6 more coming. So Marketing Mess publishes on May 11th. Job Mess to Career Success. That publishes in January of 2022. It's my next one. It's the experience of all of my success as a career coach and as an executive officer in a public company, working, living around the world. So Job Mess to Career Success comes in January. That's followed by then Communication Mess to Influence Success coming out in 2022 late. And then I'll have Sales Mess to Revenue Success, Parenting Mess to Launch Success. There's Relationship Mess. There's a whole bunch coming out over the next 8 or 10
You're redefining what the word mess means. So a couple other things on Amazon. Where can we find
everywhere?
And then where do
you can visit scottjeffreymiller.com. You can buy the books at all of the major book retailers, in books and mortar or digital. It's kind of hard not to find my books these days, fortunately.
I appreciate that. Well, Scott Miller has been our guest. And Scott, thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Scott has just given a world of great insight and advice. But also, I am recommending these wonderful books. I read Marketing Mess in 2 sittings. I couldn't put it down. And each one of those, they were very personal, written in Scott's voice, even when Scott admitted that he had lunch with his fiercest competitor and people couldn't believe you. What? And he was very clear. Scott, you were very clear about there are boundaries you didn't cross, but I think that's part of the mess here where we are hoping to provoke you to think differently about the rest of the world will give you conventional wisdom. And Scott, while there was a lot of wisdom in there, you are anything but conventional. And that's why I love having you on the show. Thank you so much.
I need you as my agent and publicist.
I love that.
Thank you.
You're
thank you
welcome.
For your generosity, and thank you for your abundance. Literally giving me a second round on your program, your platform. I'm grateful.
I appreciate it. You were great on the first one. So I'm Chuck Garcia. You can always reach me at chuckgarcia.com. I am very proud to have announced last week the launch of our Emotional Intelligence Lab. It's our online learning platform. I also want to thank our sponsors, Climber, CLMBR. They have redefined the climbing machine. Their investors include Novak Djokovic, Jay-Z, and Ryan Seacrest. You can go to clmbr.com, climber.com, and for $250 discount, type in Chuck250 if you buy it. Thank you to Climber. Thank you to Scott Miller for bringing your wonderful work into the universe.
Chuck, thank you.
Thank you very much. And to our listeners, we are signing off. Good night.
We're getting excited. We've got cardio conditioning, we got strength training, all combined. Sit low, reach high, come on. Keep working, keep working. Rotating those hands all the way up. Nice controlled movement.